Hello and welcome to the Game Dev London podcast, a community of amazing people who love talking about and sharing their love for the details behind making games, whether or not they're actually based in London. I'm your host, I'm Oscar Clark, he, him pronouns, and I'm on a quest to understand everything you wanted to know about game dev but never dared to ask. And today I am delighted to be joined by Dan Bergin-Holly, production manager at Fortitude Games, and we're going to explore the topic of production planning. Dan is a passionate product manager, producer, used to a wide range of scales and environments and pressures, of course. So, Dan, I'm going to bring you on the screen. Dan,
Hello.
tell us a little bit more about yourself.
How's it going? So my name's Dan, he, him, for those who are curious. I am currently working for Fortitude Games, which is part of the Tonic Games group. So I'm working on Fall Guys, which is a game some people might be familiar with.
Sure, I've heard of that one somewhere.
Yeah, there was something recent, some recent event that happened, some award or something, I think. Anyway, so I'm working production with that game alongside Mediatonic. So Fortitude is kind of a sister studio to Mediatonic, and we were all hands on deck for the last kind of year or so around Fall Guys. Prior to that, I worked primarily in mobile. I worked for a company called Exient, working on some Angry Birds games, Angry Birds Transformers and Angry Birds Go. Before that, I worked a little bit with Sega for some Sonic games. So 12-year-old me was very excited. Sonic and then Transformers. It was like a little dream come true.
That, isn't it?
Yeah.
The Transformers game, I think, actually introduced a couple of really interesting mechanics, and particularly if you're into free-to-play design, there was a particular mechanic with using rewarded ads to deliver kind of reward doubling which at the time was really innovative, really kind of
yes, yeah.
So anyway, let's move move swiftly on. So I'm just trying to get your title is coming up a little large, so it's overlaid a little bit. So I'm just fixing
nothing
that.
but text.
Nothing but text that you can't read. Anyway, so moving swiftly on. So what on earth is production in games look like? I mean, so we want to explore this topic of production planning. So, people who are listening to this podcast are probably going to be quite, understand the making of a game. But I find it's often the case that people don't understand what producers do. They don't understand what production planning's about. They just go and make a game, don't they? And it's not that simple, I don't think. What do you say?
Yeah, so I guess it varies hugely depending on what studio you go to. Is probably the first thing. In smaller studios, you'll often find the producer's the person who does anything that nobody else wants to do. Would be how I'd describe it.
That's my job.
Yeah. So, maybe you've got people who are kind of coding the game, people who are doing the art, people who are doing the design, and then somebody needs to fill out invoices and make sure we have licenses for things. And we've run out of hardware. Can we get a hardware order in? Producer, that's the person who fills out all those bits and pieces. In a bigger studio, you might start splitting that work out. Some stuff might go to an office manager, some stuff might go to IT, that kind of thing. But really, kind of to answer, I guess, more formally, the producer's main question is, can we deliver what we've promised with the time and the resources that we have? And pretty much all of their work is trying to make sure the answer is always yes. So everything that they do focuses on that. And that might sometimes mean changing what we've promised. Yeah. It might sometimes mean changing what the resources are. It might sometimes mean changing the timelines. But essentially, that's it. Can we do what we want to do with the time that we have and the resources that we have? And the producer is the person who looks to answer that question.
And I find it's often about working out that critical path, that kind of like, because particularly because games I think is slightly different than maybe traditional IT because there's so much iteration, but it's understanding that kind of resource plan, and and who is going to be the kind of blockage in that process. And it's not always straightforward, because if you're going to try and work out what a scene looks like, you've probably got to think about what the lighting is going to look like. And that means whoever's going to be managing the rendering engine has to work out how that's going to operate. I remember having long conversations when we were doing PlayStation Home about ocular occlusion. I didn't even know what ocular occlusion was at the time. I now do. And just those sort of details isn't something a traditional producer would necessarily know, but they've got to be able to accommodate those consequences. How do you even go? How do you even start that process?
Well, probably the main thing to kind of bear in mind is that producers a lot of facilitation. So the trap I think that some people fall into is assuming that you need to know everything if you're a producer, that you have to be the expert in every single field. And really, what you're trying to do is gather together answers from everybody else into a big answer soup and try and sieve out the chunks to result in something that's a nice, neat response. So I think that kind of means that a lot of producers you'll find will know, they'll be familiar with a lot of terms and they'll know a little bit about lots. But if you ask them to explain it in any more depth for any more than 10 minutes, they're at a complete loss. So really the place to begin is by speaking to the rest of your team, talking to them about like, okay, cool. What are the main things that we want to try and achieve? What is it that what are we trying to do? What is it that we're actually trying to get to?
Yeah.
And get everybody to agree. And sometimes that's surprisingly difficult to get everybody in the room to be like, oh, no, actually, this is the game that we're making, or this is the feature that we're delivering.
But again, doesn't
Oftentimes,
that come down to who actually owns the game? I mean, you and I have both been product owners in various forms.
yeah,
One of the things about technically my role in PlayStation wasn't that; it was requirements, but essentially a very similar role. And I didn't own the requirements. I had to negotiate what the requirements should be with each of the regions. Then I had to agree what that looked like and how they would be delivered. Then I had to agree with the development team that they would be willing to do it. The development team themselves had their own opinions about what should be done. They didn't always think that they should pay attention to what the regions wanted, even though that's how the budgeting and the politics worked.
yeah,
So I had to find a way to make it look like the game developers' ideas that were valid made them look like they were the ideas of the regions, and at the
yeah,
same time convince the development team that sometimes they actually had to do what they were asked, and that's
yeah,
really difficult, even especially when I quite often ended up agreeing with the development team about what should be
yeah,
done.
yeah,
But I also understood why the regions needed the other thing. You know what I'm saying? So
yeah,
the
yeah.
ownership
What
is
this is
really
what I mean about the answer soup, right? That you kind of go and you say, okay, well, what are we making? And you get 10 different answers, and you kind of have to take all that together and like sieve it into something that everybody can look at and recognize and feel like it's theirs, but is also
yes,
kind of simultaneously everybody else's. Um, and that's kind of, when, excuse me, when I think about like where to start, there's that kind of famous startup book, Start with Why. For a producer, it's kind of start with what, and why is a big component of that. But being able to say, okay, well, what are we actually doing? What is this? If you can get that, and if you can get a strong kind of pillar put in place for that, then you can rally everybody around it, and then everything becomes super clear, because then you can make decisions, right?
yeah. Actually, it's interesting because I hate pillars. And I'll explain why. I'm not. I don't really. I'm just being,
Yeah.
belligerent. The reason I hate pillars, though, is that pillars are a fixed point in time. What I'm
Mm,
after is a direction. I think of it more like Neverland. So Neverland is second star to the left and straight home to morning.
yeah.
So the reason why I like that is if I know what success looks like,
Yeah.
and if I know who the audience are, when I then come to make decisions, what I'm looking for is what's going to get me closest to that ambition.
Yeah.
And I think that to me is a different approach than a pillar, because it's a vector. It's not a fixed moment in time.
True, but I guess it depends on how you structure your pillars, or what we mean when we say
Yes.
pillars, right? So like I mean, this is a great example. So, like, you and I are going to have a conversation about, oh, well, we're gonna set a direction for a game. Well, what even is a direction for a game? Oh, okay, well, now we have two
Yay!
people in a room. We can't even agree on
What is a
what it.
game? Anyway, that's a different podcast. I'm doing that as well.
Yeah,
So yeah.
yeah, exactly. So that kind of thing, like, to me, with a pillar is like has to be a goal. It has to have like an achievable statement attached to it, right? So, our team will deliver this, so
Yes.
that X, that is it. That's what we're
And
aiming
it's
to do.
measured with this method. Yeah.
Yes, there's some pass fail. There's some,
Yeah.
as you say, what good looks like, or some measurement of success,
Yeah.
and it's something that is abstract enough that everyone feels that they can understand it, and specific enough that it's clear what isn't included.
Yes.
To me, that's kind of all a pillar has to do. I think sometimes people get into pillars and they get into, they do art mood boards, and then they do all these comparison titles, and they do all this mapping, and all that stuff is hugely useful,
Mm.
but it's not a pillar. It doesn't, I can't, if I take a little compass and I hang all my competitors on that compass and say, okay, well, I'm this much hardcore, but also this much casual, and maybe a little bit this much fantasy, and maybe over here on sci-fi. Like, that's interesting for making some decisions, but it doesn't empower the team. The team
Well,
can't look at that chart and go,
it's
oh yeah,
interesting
cool.
for me as a designer, but then I've got to put down some use cases that a coder can actually do something about.
Yeah,
Otherwise, it's just theory. It's just abstract.
yeah, exactly. And in such a way that, when the coder has a brainwave at 2 in the morning and
Yeah.
decides that they, for some reason want to go back to work at 2 in the morning, and they start hammering through something and they hit a problem, you want them to be able to think through that problem without having to call you, right?
Precisely.
That's the big thing to me, is if you get everybody to agree on what, then everyone's empowered to deliver because they know exactly what they're aiming for. And you don't have to be like, oh, page 78 of the design spec mentioned that the door handle turns counterclockwise, but if the door's open, then the handle's turning clockwise when I'm facing it. Should the door always turn? Like, you don't have to have those kind of questions. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? You
Yeah.
just have, like, well, we need a door. You go through the door opens and closes. Great, cool. Everything else totally up to you. You know what we're trying to achieve. It's a
And
casual
I think
game.
that's
It
a
doesn't
really
need to be.
important point with designer is to paint the picture, not necessarily every pixel. And that's a tough balance to draw sometimes.
Yeah, and that's, to tie it back to your original question around production planning. That's also kind of part of what you're doing in the planning. It's almost more like you're budgeting. So you're trying to say to somebody, okay, all right, we got a drum kit. We want to make a drum kit. There's a kick drum, a snare, and a hi hat, and we've got a month. So could we spend a week on the hi hat because it's just a thing of metal, 2 weeks on the kick drum because that's going to take a lot of time to work out how to make a drum, and then a week on the snare because we've already worked out how to make a drum from the kick drum. And you have that kind of broad conversation. You don't get into the materials and the stretch and the tone and all that kind of jazz. It's about that, trying to find those broad strokes that gives you enough space to deliver something, as long as you're clear what it is you're delivering.